Welcome to Darkverse. I'm Isaac Nightshade, your guide through the eerie, the unknown, and the stories that linger in the shadows. Now, I'm not your average storyteller. I've spent 69 years weaving words, creating worlds, and sharing the stories that haunt my mind. But now, with the weight of my years and the stories still left to tell, I've come here to share them with you. Writing has been my life, my craft, my passion, my escape. But now it's time to let the world in on what's been waiting, in the dark corners of my imagination. So if you're intrigued by the stories I'm about to share, if you find comfort in the chill of the unknown, consider subscribing. Support an old writer, someone who spent his years in ink and silence. Your support means more than you know. Join me. Let's explore the Darkverse together. Tonight, you're about to hear a tale that will chill your bones and linger in your mind long after the final word. The Haunting of Blackthorn Hollow is a story you won't soon forget. Let's begin. Claire Morgan never believed in ghosts. That was the mantra she had lived by for years. As a writer, she had made a name for herself researching the obscure, the strange, and the unsettling. But no matter how many dark stories she uncovered, no matter how many haunted places she explored, she always insisted that there had to be a logical explanation for everything. Ghosts were simply figments of imagination, the product of folklore and fear. And yet, as Claire stared at the letter on her desk, she couldn't shake the creeping unease that had settled into her bones. The letter, its edges frayed with age, was unlike any she had received before. The ink, though faded, was still legible, and the words were simple but striking. Find it. There was no return address, no signature, only the wax seal pressed into the paper, a strange symbol of interlocking spirals, like a labyrinth drawn in shadow. Beneath it was the word Blackthorn, bold and definitive. Claire had heard the stories of Blackthorn Hollow, tales of a mansion that had stood for decades, abandoned and decaying, but still cloaked in mystery. The house had belonged to Elijah Harrow, a professor of the occult, who had vanished along with several others who sought answers within its walls. Rumors swirled about strange rituals, disappearances, and the house's growing reputation as a place where time and space didn't quite behave as they should. Her mind raced as she sat in her small, cluttered apartment, the familiar hum of the city outside unable to drown out the unease that had taken root in her chest. She had written about Blackthorn Hollow before, reporting the legends and gossip she had collected from the locals. The place had always intrigued her, but she had dismissed it as just another piece of local myth, a story told to scare children or entertain the curious. But this letter changed everything. It was as though someone was calling her, summoning her to uncover what lay beneath the darkened roof of Blackthorn Manor. Something inside her stirred, a mixture of curiosity and dread, the kind that only appeared when there was something buried too deep to be ignored. Without fully understanding why, Claire felt the pull to investigate. She had worked her entire career on uncovering the truth of these legends, and this felt like it could be the one that mattered, the one that would change everything. Claire packed her things, quickly: camera, notebook, pens, and a few snacks. There was no telling how long she might need to stay. She had no idea what she would find, but that was the nature of her work, exploring the unknown, peeling back the layers of the strange and the supernatural to uncover whatever truths lay beneath. The drive out to Blackthorn Hollow was long, winding through hills and forests, where the trees grew tall and thick, their branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. The silence of the road grew heavier with each passing mile. She'd driven this route before, but today it felt different. The air felt thicker, colder, as though the world was holding its breath in anticipation. The closer she got to the hollow, the more the feeling pressed against her chest, a quiet pressure that whispered for her to turn back. But Claire never turned back. Not when she was so close to the answers. As she neared the hollow, the landscape began to change. The trees grew denser, their trunks gnarled and twisted as if they had been shaped by some unseen force. The road, once clear and wide, narrowed into a dirt path that seemed to wind its way deeper into the heart of the forest. Claire's car bounced over the uneven ground, her headlights barely cutting through the growing mist that began to settle in the woods like a shroud. It wasn't until she saw it, that first glimpse of the mansion, that the weight of it all truly began to settle in. Blackthorn Manor stood at the end of the path, shrouded in the dim light of dusk. The stone walls were covered in ivy, the windows dark like hollow eyes, staring out into the thickening fog. For a moment, Claire paused, the sense of dread that had been building since she'd received the letter suddenly intensifying. The house loomed ahead, oppressive and foreboding, but Claire knew she had come too far to turn back now. She parked the car at the edge of the property, taking one last glance at the sprawling woods that seemed to stretch endlessly around her. The air had grown noticeably colder, and the once gentle breeze had become still, like the world itself was waiting for her to step inside. With a deep breath, Claire gathered her things and approached the front door of Blackthorn Manor. The gate that led into the property was rusted and half forgotten, as though no one had cared for it in years. The iron bars were twisted, the paint chipped and flaking, and the whole thing seemed to sag as though time itself had worn it down. The door to the manor stood ajar, just a crack, as if it had been expecting her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crossed the threshold. The air inside was thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of decay. The floor creaked beneath her boots as she stepped forward into the darkness, the fading light from the outside world barely illuminating the hallway ahead. It was as though the house had been holding its breath, waiting for her to arrive. The walls were lined with faded portraits of people Claire didn't recognize, their eyes following her as she walked past them. The house seemed to be alive with the whispers of the past, faint echoes of lives once lived here, now long gone. Her steps faltered as the strange sensation of being watched settled over her once again. She wasn't alone in this place, she could feel it. She moved deeper into the house, her flashlight flickering as if it, too, was unsure of the path ahead. Every corner she turned seemed to hold more shadows, more remnants of a life that had been left behind in haste. Old furniture, now covered in dust and cobwebs, sat in rooms that had clearly not been used in years. A strange coldness seeped from the walls, and the air was thick with something more than just age. It was as if the house itself had an energy, a presence that filled the room. As Claire entered what seemed to be the library, the heavy air pressed against her chest. Shelves upon shelves of books, some of them missing. Their spines, others twisted and warped with age, lined the walls. In the center of the room sat a large faded portrait of a man, a professor perhaps, or someone important to the house's history. His face was stern, his eyes dark and watchful, though something about the painting seemed off, as if the man, whoever he had been, still lingered in the room. Claire's fingers brushed against the edge of a nearby shelf, and that's when she saw it, the violin. It was nestled on a dusty table in the corner, its wood cracked, but its strings still taut, as though it had been waiting for someone to pick it up. Claire felt drawn to it, but as she reached out, a shiver ran down her spine. The air around her seemed to chill even more, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard something, soft, barely audible, coming from the violin. A faint, mournful tune. Claire stepped back, heart racing, but the pull of the instrument was too strong. She reached out again, fingers grazing the cool surface of the violin, and as soon as she did, a strange sensation filled her chest. The air thickened, the temperature plummeted, and the house seemed to shudder with life. Claire's car hummed steadily along the narrow, winding road that led deeper into Blackthorn Hollow. The engine purred, unbothered by the bumps and dips in the overgrown path, but Claire's eyes flicked nervously to the trees that loomed over her. Their bare limbs stretched out like twisted fingers, grasping at the twilight sky as the last rays of sunlight bled into the horizon. She had been driving for hours now, the miles stretching endlessly before her, each turn more isolated than the last. The small town she had passed through earlier was the last sign of civilization, the last place where the world had seemed like it still made sense. But now, here in the woods, that world felt increasingly distant, almost as if it belonged to another time. A time before the car, before the roads, before Claire had even been born. The forest pressed in on either side, thick with vines that hung like curtains, half obscuring the dirt path ahead. Every so often, a gust of wind would stir the trees, their branches creaking as if they were alive, murmuring to one another in a language Claire couldn't understand. The air had grown cooler too, not the sharp cold of winter, but the kind of deep, pervasive chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. She had heard the rumors about Blackthorn Hollow for years. The tales had always seemed a little too fantastical. Stories of disappearances, of whispers in the night, of a house that was more than just bricks and mortar. But there was something about this place, something that had lingered in her mind ever since she had first read about it in one of her research journals. The abandoned manor had been standing for decades, and no one knew exactly what had happened to the people who once lived there. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was a portal to something darker. Claire had never been one to believe in curses, but there was something magnetic about the house that she couldn't quite resist. Maybe it was the mystery, or the fact that no one had dared to truly uncover the truth. Maybe it was the challenge of piecing together the missing pieces of a story that had been buried for so long. But as the road twisted further into the heart of the hollow, the feeling of isolation became more pronounced. Claire rolled down the window, the scent of wet leaves and damp earth filling her lungs. The road seemed to grow darker with each mile. The trees closed in tighter, their branches entwining above her, blocking out the last of the sunlight. She glanced in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the road she had just passed, but all she could see was an endless stretch of shadows. It's just the trees, she told herself. It's just the forest. But even as she said it, something in her stomach tightened, a small knot of unease that refused to loosen. Something wasn't right. And then, just as she rounded another bend in the road, she saw it. A pale figure, fleeting, just beyond the trees. It was a flash of white, barely visible between the thick trunks, a shape that seemed almost too perfect to be real. For a heartbeat, Claire's eyes locked onto it, her mind racing to process what she had seen. A person? A ghost? A trick of the light? She slammed her foot on the brake, the tires skidding briefly on the gravel. The car jerked to a stop, and Claire's breath hitched in her chest. She stared out the windshield wide-eyed, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of trees and vines, swaying in the soft breeze. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel, her fingers digging into the leather. She could feel her pulse racing in her throat, a sudden surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Did I imagine it? She wondered. Was it a trick of the light? But no, she had seen it. She had seen something. The pale figure. A fleeting glimpse of a person, or something like a person, standing in the woods watching her. She took a slow, shuddering breath, trying to calm herself. It was probably just an animal, some kind of trick her mind had played on her. The kind of thing that happened when you were out in the woods alone, with nothing but the sound of your own thoughts for company. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching her, that something in the trees was waiting for her to come closer. She glanced in the mirror again, just to be sure, but there was no movement. The road behind her was as empty as it had been when she had passed through it minutes earlier. Just keep going, Claire thought. She had come this far. The house was close. She had to push forward. With a shaky breath, Claire put the car in gear and pressed on. The road was dark now, the trees pressing closer with each turn, their gnarled branches reaching toward the car like skeletal hands. The feeling of being watched intensified, crawling up her spine and twisting her stomach into knots. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward her, and for a moment, she almost swore she saw something move in the corner of her vision. Another pale figure, this time just to the left of the road. Claire's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles turning white as she sped down the narrow path. The sound of the tires on the gravel was the only noise in the stillness of the forest. Every now and then, a low creak would come from the trees, like a warning or a sigh of discontent. Her breath was shallow and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She tried to shake off the growing dread, but the feeling of being followed, being watched, wouldn't let go. It wrapped around her chest like a vice. And then, just as she rounded yet another bend, the house appeared before her, shrouded in the shadows of the evening. Blackthorn Manor. The sight of it took her breath away. The house was enormous, its stone walls dark and weathered by time, its windows cold and empty like hollow eyes. The trees surrounding the manor seemed to recede into the darkness, leaving the house standing stark against the forest, as though it had been waiting for her. The iron gate, once grand but now rusted and barely hanging from its hinges, stood open, welcoming her to the decaying ruins. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she pulled the car to a stop in front of the gate. She stared at the house for a long moment, her mind racing with thoughts of the figure she had seen, the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled into her bones. This is it, she thought. This is what I've been searching for. But even as she thought it, a shiver ran down her spine. She had arrived, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever the manor had in store for her. Claire stood at the edge of Blackthorn Hollow, her eyes fixed on the rusted iron gate that stood before her. It was barely more than a skeleton. Of its former self, the metal twisted and eaten away by time, wrapped in thick vines that had long ago claimed it as their own. The gate creaked in the wind, its hinges protesting with a mournful groan, as if reluctant to be disturbed. The sight of it felt like an omen, an unwelcome invitation to a place that had been forgotten for too long. Beyond the gate, the mansion loomed. Blackthorn Manor, once grand and imposing, now nothing more than a decaying relic of a forgotten past. The stone walls, though still standing, were weathered and crumbling, the ivy climbing up their surface like veins feeding into a dying heart. The house towered over the hollow, its jagged edges and broken windows casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the ground. The very sight of it made Claire's stomach tighten, as if the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to enter. The trees surrounding the manor stood unnaturally still, their branches thick and twisted, blocking out the last remnants of sunlight. The air had grown colder the moment she arrived, a chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to stave off the oppressive cold that now hung in the air. The silence was deafening. There was no sound of birds or animals, no breeze stirring the leaves. The forest felt as if it had held its breath, as if it were waiting for something. Claire took a cautious step forward, her boots crunching softly on the overgrown path that led to the gate. She felt the weight of the place settling over her, the sensation that something ancient and malevolent was just beneath the surface, watching her every move. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the cold iron of the gate, feeling the years of neglect in its rough surface. The rust was thick, the vines curling around it as though trying to keep her out. But the gate stood open, offering her no resistance. She glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see something, someone watching her from the trees, but there was nothing. Just the vast expanse of the hollow, shrouded in silence. She turned her attention back to the mansion, her heart beating faster as she approached the gate. The moment she stepped through, the air seemed to grow even colder, the temperature plummeting as though the house itself were pulling the warmth from the world around it. Claire hesitated for a moment, the feeling of dread growing heavier in her chest, but her curiosity and her determination to uncover the truth pushed her forward. She crossed the threshold and entered the hollow, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The trees around her seemed to bend inward, their gnarled branches stretching toward the house as though they, too, were drawn to its dark presence. The silence in the hollow was unnerving, suffocating, and for a moment, Claire thought she could hear something. Whispers, faint and distant, carried on the wind. She stopped just inside the gate, her gaze drifting up toward the house. It seemed to rise before her, its towering structure casting an almost oppressive shadow over the hollow. The broken windows stared back at her like hollow eyes, and Claire had the distinct feeling that the house was studying her, silently waiting for her to make her next move. She could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the house had always been here, had always been watching, and now it had decided she was the one to come. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and continued forward, her footsteps soft on the gravel path that led to the house's front steps. The feeling of being watched didn't lessen. It only grew stronger, and Claire couldn't shake the thought that there was something in the house, something waiting for her, something that had been waiting for a very long time. As she stepped closer to the mansion, a sudden gust of wind rattled the gate behind her. Claire froze, her heart skipping a beat as she whipped around to face the sound. The gate groaned, its rusted hinges screeching loudly as the wind swept through, pulling at the vines that clung to the iron. But when Claire turned to look, there was nothing behind her. No sign of movement, no breeze rustling the trees. The hollow was eerily still. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she turned back toward the house. It was almost as if the wind had been a warning, a reminder that she was no longer alone. The house had heard her steps. The house knew she was here. The temperature seemed to drop even further as she ascended the steps, her breath coming out in visible puffs in the frigid air. The doors of the mansion stood open, wide enough for her to step inside. Yet there was no welcoming warmth, no sign of life. The darkness inside the house felt like a void, beckoning her into its depths. Claire hesitated for a moment, standing at the threshold, her gaze fixed on the dark interior. The silence was so complete that it was almost suffocating, pressing against her from all sides. And then, just as she was about to take another step, she heard it, the faintest sound, almost like a whisper. Welcome. The word was soft, carried by the wind, and for a moment Claire thought she had imagined it. But as the silence stretched on, she knew she hadn't. The voice was real, alive, and it had come from inside the house. The heavy wooden door closed behind Claire with a soft, final thud, the sound of it locking her in, as though the house itself had decided that she was meant to stay. The foyer before her was shrouded in shadow, but even in the dim light, Claire could see the grand scale of the manor. Its once immense size now marred by neglect. The stone walls were damp with age, streaked with dark marks that told the tale of years spent in isolation. Her boots echoed in the silence as she stepped forward, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and something else. A faint, almost metallic smell, like rusted iron or old blood. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, instinctively drawing closer to the walls as she ventured deeper into the heart of Blackthorn Manor. The house had the feel of a place long abandoned, left to decay and crumble, as if the passage of time itself had consumed it. Yet there was something about it that didn't quite sit right. The stillness was unnerving. It was as though the house hadn't been abandoned simply due to age, but because something or someone had driven its occupants away. Something had been here, something had happened, and whatever that was had lingered in the bones of the house, leaving behind only shadows and forgotten whispers. The silence pressed down on her, every step she took making the space feel larger, more oppressive. Faded portraits lined the walls, their once proud frames now cracked and decaying, the paint peeling from their surfaces. The faces in the portraits stared at her with vacant eyes, eyes that once might have been full of life, but now only seemed to be etched with sorrow and regret. The once elegant furniture was now covered in thick layers of dust, their lines softened by years of neglect. The once beautiful tapestries hung in tatters, their vibrant colors now faded to sickly hues of brown and gray. She wandered through the foyer, her eyes drawn to the shelves stacked high with old books, their spines faded and cracked with age. The smell of mildew mixed with the musty scent of paper, and Claire's fingers itched to touch the forgotten tomes, to uncover whatever secrets they held. She reached for the nearest book, her hand brushing the spine, and as she did, the faintest sound broke the silence. It was soft at first, barely perceptible, but unmistakable, the sound of a violin. At first, Claire thought it was just the house settling, another creak of the floorboards, another groan of the old wood. But no, it wasn't like that. This sound was distinct, melodic, the sharp yet mournful bow across strings, a tune that was almost too beautiful to be real. It was so faint that she wondered if her mind was playing tricks on her, but the melody was too clear, too sorrowful to ignore. She froze, her fingers still lingering on the spine of the book, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The sound seemed to come from beneath her feet, from deep within the manor's foundation, like it was rising from the very bones of the house. The melody was haunting, a soft and melancholic tune that seemed to echo through the floorboards, reverberating in the walls around her. What is that? Claire thought, her breath catching in her throat. It's too soft, too real. She glanced down at the floor, as though expecting to see the source of the sound beneath her. The violin's tune swelled, rising higher, and for a moment it felt as though the house itself was alive, that it was breathing with her, singing its sorrow through. The strings. Am I losing my mind? She took a step back, her fingers still brushing the dusty bookshelves. The song was still playing, so faint, so delicate, but so undeniably there. Claire pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady her breath, trying to push the rising sense of unease out of her mind. It's nothing, she told herself. Just the house settling, just the wind moving through the walls. But she knew deep down that it wasn't just the wind. The music, no, the tune, was something more. It was alive, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the house, and it was calling her, beckoning her to listen, to follow its sorrowful, twisted notes. Her gaze flicked to the staircase ahead of her, leading up into the dark shadows of the upper floor. The music was faint, but it seemed to beckon her upward, as if urging her to climb higher into the heart of the house. The tune grew more insistent, its strings vibrating in her chest, reverberating with an energy that made the hair on her arms rise. Without thinking, Claire moved toward the staircase, her footsteps quiet on the dust-covered floor. The violin's song filled the space around her, growing louder with each step she took, almost as if it were guiding her, pushing her forward. She reached the base of the stairs and hesitated, looking back over her shoulder at the room below. The darkness in the manor seemed to grow thicker as she moved, the shadows swallowing the light of her flashlight. But the music, the tune, pulled her forward, its melancholy rhythm filling her mind and urging her to climb higher. The stairs creaked beneath her weight as she ascended, the sound of her movement drowned out by the violin song. It was louder now, sharper, as though the very house had begun to hum along with the melody. Claire's pulse quickened as she reached the top of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The door at the end of the hallway creaked open, and she stepped into a small, dimly lit room. Inside, the source of the music was clear. An old, cracked violin lay on a pedestal in the center of the room, bathed in a shaft of pale moonlight that filtered through a broken window. The strings were still vibrating, still resonating with the same mournful tune that had filled the air. Claire stepped closer, her breath shallow, her hands trembling as she reached for the instrument. Claire continued to move deeper into the manor, her steps echoing through the long, dark hallways. Each room she passed seemed more abandoned than the last. Dust-covered furniture, broken mirrors, and faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. The once elegant decor had deteriorated into a rotting husk of what it used to be. But still, the feeling that something was wrong lingered in the air, a weight that pressed down on her chest with every breath she took. At first, she had chalked it up to the house's long abandonment, the isolation of the place creating an atmosphere thick with quiet. But now as she wandered, through the eerie silence, it felt as though the house was alive, and it was watching her. Her flashlight flickered again, casting strange, erratic shadows on the walls. At first, she assumed it was just the battery dying, but as she tried to adjust the beam, it continued to pulse, its light growing dim and erratic. She shone it down a long corridor, and for a moment, the walls seemed to stretch, their angles warping as though the house itself were shifting in front of her eyes. Claire's stomach churned as she pressed forward, the shadows now longer, more twisted, as if reaching out for her. Every time she looked over her shoulder, they seemed to be a little closer, a little darker. The sense of being watched intensified, crawling up her spine and settling deep into the pit of her stomach. Her breath quickened as she walked, her eyes darting back and forth between the walls, convinced that someone or something was following her, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and every creak of the floorboards seemed louder than the last. The house had always been cold, but now it was as though the temperature had dropped even further, a bone-chilling frost settling in the air. Her fingers numbed as she gripped the flashlight tighter. its beam dancing across the darkened rooms, revealing little more than emptiness. But that emptiness felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. Claire paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She had come here to uncover the truth, to explore the mysteries hidden within these walls. But now, standing in the heart of the manor, she felt more like an intruder, a trespasser in a place that had been forgotten by time, but not by the darkness that clung to it. As she stepped forward, she felt it again. The cold presence behind her. A chill ran down her spine, sharp and sudden, as if someone were standing just a few inches away from her. It wasn't the cold of the house. This was something else entirely, something alive. Her skin prickled, and she instinctively spun around, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness behind her. But when she turned, there was nothing, just empty space, the shadows deepening and curling against the walls as if they were absorbing her movements. Her pulse quickened as she whipped back around to face the front, only to be met by something that made her blood run cold. The violin song. It wasn't just faint anymore. It was louder, unmistakable, as though it was playing right behind her, filling the air with its mournful, melodic tune. It was the same soft, sorrowful melody she had heard earlier, but now it was accompanied by an unsettling sense of urgency. The song had shifted, no longer a quiet whisper, but an almost demanding presence, the strings pulling at her like an invisible force. Claire froze, her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned, expecting to see the violin once more. But no, nothing was there. The music continued to fill the space around her, yet the source was nowhere to be found. Her hands shook as she reached for the flashlight, its light flickering again, but it did nothing to banish the shadows that clung to the edges of the room. The violin's song seemed to be following her now, echoing through the walls, and she had the horrifying feeling that it was somehow aware of her presence, aware of her every movement. It was no longer the soft, haunting melody it had been. Before, it had become a frantic, twisting cry, as if pleading for her to listen, to acknowledge it. Where is it coming from? Claire thought, her pulse hammering in her ears. She glanced around the room, the flashlight beam trembling in her grip. The walls were bare, the room empty save for the shattered furniture and the dust motes dancing in the dim light. The music seemed to emanate from the very air itself, as if it was being played by an invisible hand. There was no instrument, no violin in sight. A cold gust of air rushed through the hallway, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It swirled around her, tugging at her clothes as if trying to pull her toward something. She instinctively took a step back, but the music, the song, grew louder, more insistent. The darkness seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides, and Claire felt her heart race as though it was trying to break free of her chest. And then she felt it again, a cold hand, this time brushing lightly, against her shoulder. Her body went rigid with fear as her breath caught in her throat. She spun around quickly, her heart pounding in her ears, but there was no one there. No one in the hallway, no figures lurking in the shadows. The space around her was empty, but the hand, she had felt it. It wasn't just her imagination. It was real, cold and unyielding, like the touch of something dead. Claire wandered deeper into Blackthorn Manor, her steps slow and deliberate, as though the house itself were pulling her through its darkened halls. The oppressive atmosphere had only grown thicker with each passing moment. It was no longer just an old abandoned mansion. There was something about it now that made it feel alive, and the very air seemed to hum with a low, constant vibration, like a heartbeat that never stopped. The violin's song had faded to a distant, ghostly echo, but the strange sensation of being watched never left her. She felt it everywhere, an unseen presence that clung to her, followed her through the rooms, watching her every move. She had no doubt now that whatever had once lived here, whatever had been trapped within these walls, had never truly left. As she entered the farthest reaches of the house, she found herself in a part of the manor that seemed to be even more decayed than the rest. The air here was heavier, dust thicker, the silence more profound. The rooms were smaller, more cramped, the windows sealed shut with layers of grime, and the walls sagged with the weight of age. Claire's flashlight beam flickered again, the light stuttering as though the very electricity in the house resented being disturbed. Her eyes swept over the room, landing on a large tattered tapestry that hung low against one wall. The fabric was frayed at the edges, its once vibrant colors now muted by years of neglect. Yet something about it felt wrong, the way it hung there, slightly askew, as though it was hiding something. A pulse of unease shivered through Claire's chest as she approached, unable to shake the feeling that the tapestry was more than just an old decoration. Her heart raced as her fingers brushed the coarse fabric, pulling it aside with a sudden, almost violent motion. What she revealed stopped her in her tracks. A door. Unlike anything else she had seen in the manor, it stood there, dark and foreboding. Its wood was ancient, warped with age, and deeply stained with what seemed to be years of dust and decay. But what truly caught Claire's attention were the symbols carved into the door, twisted occult markings that seemed to pulse and shimmer in the dim light, as though they were alive. The symbols were foreign to her, twisted and indecipherable, but there was no mistaking their intention. They were wrong. They did not belong here. A sudden chill ran down her spine as she stared at the door. It called to her. She could feel it, almost like an electric current in the air, an unseen force pulling her toward it, urging her to reach out and touch it. She knew she shouldn't. She knew the house was hiding something far darker than she could imagine. But the door was a magnet, and despite her better judgment, her hand was already reaching for the cold, tarnished doorknob. As her fingers closed around it, a jolt of icy electricity shot through her arm. She gasped, stepping back instinctively, but her hand remained locked on the handle. The sensation was sharp, almost painful, and for a moment, Claire thought she might lose control. But there was no turning back. She had to open it. She had to know what lay behind the door. Her pulse quickened as she turned the doorknob, her hands shaking as the door creaked open with a deep, mournful groan. The air around her seemed to change in that instant, becoming thicker, colder, as if the house itself exhaled a breath, holding its secret just beyond the threshold. Claire stepped into the darkness, her heart hammering in her chest as the door opened wide. The room beyond was circular, far smaller than she had anticipated, but it was unlike anything she had ever seen before. The walls were bare stone, but the space itself seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as though the room was alive, breathing with the same rhythm as the house. The faintest glow radiated from the center of the room, where an old iron pedestal stood, its surface gleaming faintly in the dark. And then Claire saw it, what lay at the center of the room. A figure. It was not solid. First it seemed like a shadow, a flicker of movement in the dim glow. But as she stepped closer, she realized it was more than that. It was a pale, twisted figure, its body thin and emaciated, a blur of pale skin stretched tightly over bones. The figure's face was twisted in agony, its eyes wide and empty, the dark hollows of its gaze seeming to stare straight through her, into her very soul. Claire's breath hitched in her throat, and her body went rigid with terror. She took a step back, but the figure followed her, its eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, Claire felt as though it were pulling her closer, dragging her toward it. She fought the urge to run, to scream, but her body refused to obey. She could feel the weight of its presence, its despair, its torment, like a physical force pressing down on her chest. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving only the eerie pulse of energy in the room. The glow from the pedestal dimmed. The air grew still, and Claire stood frozen in the doorway, her heart racing in her chest. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash, sending a shiver through Claire's body. The suddenness of it made her heart lurch, but before she could react, the room before her pulled her attention completely. The space was unlike anything else she had encountered in Blackthorn Manor. Circular in shape, the stone walls seemed to close in around her, their surfaces covered in strange, twisted symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The floor was no better. Dark, swirling patterns of occult symbols were carved deeply into the stone, their shapes so intricate that they seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The air was thick, almost tangible, and it hummed with an unnatural vibration that rattled her bones. The longer she stood in the center of the room, the heavier the atmosphere became. It wasn't just oppressive, it felt suffocating, as though the room itself was drawing the breath from her lungs. At the center of the room sat a pedestal, blackened and worn with age. Upon it rested the violin, the same one she had heard playing earlier, its strings still vibrating with an eerie resonance. There was no mistaking it now. The song that had plagued her from the moment she entered the house was coming from this very room, as though the violin itself had been calling her to it. Her body felt like it was moving on its own, her feet drawn toward the pedestal, the violin calling to her with a voice that only she could hear. The whispers, faint at first, now filled the room. They were soft at first, like a gentle breeze brushing against her ears, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. Stay. Stay with us. You must stay. Claire's breath hitched, her heart racing. She recognized the tone. Pleading. Desperate. They weren't just whispers now. They were voices. Voices that seemed to crawl through the air and wrap around her like a chain. There were two, many to count, each one a fragment of a soul that had been lost within these walls, calling out to her, urging her to remain in the room, to remain in the house. The violin seemed to hum with energy as she stepped closer to it, the strings now vibrating with an unsettling resonance, drawing her in. She couldn't help it. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the instrument. The moment her fingers made contact with the strings, everything in the room shifted. A blast of cold air shot through the room, slamming into her like an invisible wave. The chill cut through her clothes, sinking deep into her skin, and Claire gasped, a breath of icy fog spilling from her lips. She stumbled back, but her hand remained fixed on the violin, the strings vibrating beneath her fingertips. Suddenly, the room came alive. The air pulsed with a strange energy, thick with power. The whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening, their pleas now accompanied by the sharp, mournful sound of the violin, a song that no human hands were playing. The strings on the violin moved of their own accord, the bow gliding across them with a delicate, graceful motion. The melody was haunting, drawn out with an aching sadness, like a soul crying out in despair. Claire's chest tightened, her heart beating in time with the eerie music. It was too much. The sound filled the room, wrapping around her, infiltrating her thoughts, making it impossible to think of anything else. And yet, as much as she wanted to pull away, as much as her mind screamed for her to stop, her hand moved on its own, following the pull of the violin. She felt her fingers moving on the bow, felt her hand guiding it across the strings as if it had always known how. The music, no, the song was inside her now, pulling her deeper into its rhythm, forcing her to play along. It wasn't her hand that moved the bow. She could feel it, but she couldn't stop it. Every motion, every shift of the bow was controlled by something else. The song seemed to take on a life of its own, the melody growing louder, more insistent, as though it was feeding off her presence, feeding off her very soul. The room around her seemed to pulse with the music, the cymbals on the floor glowing brighter with each stroke of the bow. The walls closed in tighter, the energy in the room thickening with each note. Claire felt like she was drowning in the sound, in the cold, in the power of it. The whispers in the air grew more frantic, more urgent. Don't stop. You mustn't stop. The music will never stop. Stay with us. Forever. Claire tried to pull away, but the sensation of the bow gliding across the strings, the violin's cry filling the space, was overpowering. She felt as though the house itself was consuming her, its energy pulling her deeper, binding her to the manor. The voices were all around her now, their desperate pleas flooding her mind, drowning out everything else. It felt as if the room, the house, was closing in, the walls pressing against her, suffocating her in the darkness. The sound of the violin grew louder, echoing through her mind, until she couldn't tell if it was still playing within the room or if it was inside her head. The cold, the darkness, the whispers, they were all merging together, wrapping her in a cocoon of hopelessness. There was no escape. The violin song had not stopped. In fact, it had grown louder, more urgent, filling the room with a sorrowful, rhythmic wail that seemed to pierce. Through Claire's very soul, the music vibrated in her chest, in her bones, and it was all she could hear. There was nothing else but the melody, the long, drawn-out, haunting tune that seemed to wrap itself around her like a noose. And the temperature had dropped, drastically so. The chill in the room was unbearable now, icy tendrils wrapping around her limbs, creeping into her skin, freezing her from the inside out. Claire shivered uncontrollably, but she couldn't move, couldn't break free from the grip the violin had on her. It was like a force, an invisible hand that held her in place. She couldn't pull away from the instrument. She couldn't stop the movement of her fingers on the bow, as if they were no longer hers to command. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, misting in the air as the room seemed to close in around her. The walls, once distant, now felt suffocatingly close. They bent inward, shifting with a sickening, unnatural rhythm, pulsing like a living, breathing entity. The floorboards beneath her feet creaked as if the house itself were shifting, groaning with every movement she made. The whispers had returned, low, rasping voices that came from all directions, swirling around her like a storm. But these weren't the same soft, pleading voices from earlier. These were anguished cries, filled with desperation and pain. Leave. Leave now. You don't belong here. Run. While you still can. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. But she couldn't bring herself to stop playing. The violin demanded it. She had to play, had to continue the song. The room seemed to be alive with energy, vibrating with an unnatural pulse, the air thick with the weight of something ancient, something dark, pressing in on her. But as the music reached a crescendo, the temperature dropped further, and the whispers became something else, something far darker. The floor beneath Claire's feet groaned again, this time louder, and she stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to move, to break free from the clutches of the music, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as though the very room had trapped her, as if the walls were closing in, forcing her to stay, to listen. Then, without warning, the shadows in the room began to shift. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a flicker in the corner of her vision. But then they came, dark, shapeless figures, rising from the corners of the room like smoke, stretching and twisting, their forms indistinguishable from the shadows that clung to the walls. They moved silently, circling around her, their glowing eyes the only clear feature in the darkness. The faint, sickly yellow light from their eyes glimmered, like the faintest reflection in the darkness. And Claire's heart raced, her chest tightening with fear. The room seemed to breathe, to pulse with each movement of the figures. They moved closer, their presence growing, surrounding her, closing in from every angle. Their bodies were formless, shifting like liquid shadows, but their eyes, they were eyes of hunger, of torment, of malice. The stench of decay filled the air, rotting flesh, mold, death. It was overpowering, making Claire's stomach churn, her throat close with nausea. One of the figures moved forward, its form melting in and out of the shadows, until it stood directly in front of her. Claire couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The figure towered over her, and she could feel its eyes, its gaze, burning into her. It leaned closer, its presence suffocating, and then, in a voice that was not her own, it whispered her name. Claire! The sound of her name, spoken by something so other, was enough to freeze her blood. It was a voice that echoed through her mind, not her own, but still it felt as though it came from within her. Deep, guttural, a voice older than time. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she tried to pull away. But the shadows around her shifted, moving with a terrible grace, blocking her escape. The violin song had become louder now, the strings crying out, and Claire felt an overwhelming compulsion to continue playing, to let the music fill her, consume her. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. Her vision blurred, her senses overwhelmed by the heavy, pungent air and the oppressive darkness that surrounded her. The shadows closed in on her, and then the figure whispered again, its voice carrying an unmistakable tone of cruelty, of hunger. You will stay with us. Forever. A scream tried to claw its way from her throat, but her voice failed her. She wanted to run. She needed to run. But she couldn't. The figures were all around her now, circling her like wolves, their eyes burning into her very soul. The room had become a prison, and she was its captive. The violin song played louder still, and Claire felt the music twist inside her, her body no longer her own. The shadows were inside her mind now, their whispers echoing in her, thoughts urging her to stay, to never leave, to belong to the house. Her hands shook violently as the bow moved on its own, gliding across the strings with an unnatural grace. It was no longer Claire playing. It was something else, something ancient and twisted, making her move, making her sing the song. The violin's tune had consumed her, and with it, the shadows, the figures. They consumed her too. The room pulsed with energy, as if the very walls were alive, the whispers rising in a maddening crescendo until the sound was unbearable, the walls closing in. The shadows stretched toward her, the darkness surrounding her, and Claire realized, too late, that she was no longer alone in the room. The house had her now. The shadows closed in on Claire, their forms shifting and writhing in the dim light, as though they were alive, moving closer with every passing second. The whispers had long since turned into maddening, shrill screams, voices crying out in agony, begging for release, for freedom. But there would be no freedom for them, not here, not in this place. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, each beat heavy and desperate, drowning in the cacophony of tortured voices. The air felt thick with an overwhelming presence, pressing in on her from all sides. She could barely breathe, could barely think. The room had become a prison, its walls closing in, its floorboards creaking under the weight of something far darker than anything she could have imagined. Her vision blurred, her head spinning, but she could still hear the violin. Its song now a cruel, twisted echo of the melody that had first drawn her in. The tune had become something more than just music. It was a conduit. The sound wasn't just filling the room anymore. It was filling her mind. It was bringing them, the souls, into the world. The figures surrounding her grew more distinct. Claire's blood ran cold as she recognized them, or at least their faces. There in the shadows were the lost souls, the ones who had disappeared here long before her, the ones who had come seeking answers, like her, only to be trapped by the house, her colleagues, the adventurers who had sought out the mysteries of Blackthorn Manor. But now they were nothing more than hollow, broken husks, their eyes wide with fear and pleading for release. Their faces were gaunt and pale, their features twisted by years or centuries of torment. They moved, or rather floated toward her, their bodies shifting in and out of form, merging with the shadows that surrounded them. As they approached, their hollow eyes locked onto Claire with a terrifying intensity, their faces twisted in an eternal scream, mouths wide in silent agony. They were once like me. The thought slammed into Claire's mind, a crushing weight that made her stomach turn. These souls, these lost souls, had once been just like her, drawn to this forsaken place, lured in by the promise of uncovering its secrets. But they had never left, and now neither would she. One by one, the souls of the lost adventurers merged with the shadows, their bodies becoming indistinguishable from the darkness itself. They were like phantoms, fading in and out, slipping between the veil of the living and the dead, but always anchored to this place, always bound to Blackthorn Manor. I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. This room, this trap, wasn't just a room. It was the prison of all those who had dared to enter, all those who had come looking for answers, but had only found despair. The violin. The violin had been their gateway. The song had never been music at all. It had been the vessel, the conduit that channeled the souls of the damned, pulling them back into the world through the strings. Those who touched it, those who played it, were no longer alive. They were a part of the house, their souls bound to it, their existence erased by the oppressive force that governed this place. The shadows shifted again, this time closing in around her like a suffocating wave. Claire could hear the whispers in her ears now, clear as day. The voices of the lost souls crying out for help, their words fading into the abyss. Don't let it take you. You belong to it now, forever. Stay with us. Stay. Claire stumbled backward, but her feet refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the weight of the truth. The shadows closed in even further, their forms now reaching out for her, their pale hands stretched toward her, pulling at her, trying to drag her into the darkness with them. She could feel them brushing against her skin, cold and clammy, their touch like ice. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the walls warping, the floorboards creaking under the pressure. It was as though the house itself was alive, feeding off the souls it had trapped, pulling Claire deeper into its darkness. The violin's song reached a crescendo, the music now, so loud it felt like a physical force, vibrating through her very bones. The whispers became one unified voice, filling her mind with the weight of their endless torment. You are one of us now. There is no escape. Stay with us, forever. Her hands gripped the violin tightly, but her fingers felt numb. No longer her own. She was no longer in control. The music had become a part of her, and the shadowy figures had fused with it, their spirits now embedded within the strings. The house was consuming her. Claire stumbled backward, her body jerking as if trying to escape the unseen force that gripped her. The room seemed to twist and distort around her, the shadows closing in with a suffocating hunger, pulling her further into their grasp. The whispers, those maddening, urgent whispers, grew louder, filling her mind with incoherent cries. She could still hear the violin, its haunting melody rising again, a wailing song of torment and inevitability. She reached for the door, the one she had entered through. But when her hand grasped the handle, the cold metal disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked around, her pulse racing in terror. The walls, once solid, now seemed to shift, to bend inward, the shadows spreading and growing like a living, breathing entity. It's not real. This can't be real. Her thoughts scattered like falling leaves as the very floor beneath her feet cracked open, a deep, rending sound, like the earth itself tearing apart. The fissures spread like veins across the room, and Claire's feet faltered as she backed away, her legs trembling. The room had become something else entirely, no longer just an abandoned space, but a twisting, alive entity, pulling her down into its depths. The violin's music played on, its sorrowful tune undisturbed by the chaos that unfolded around her. Its strings resonated in her chest, shaking her to her core. The melody was not a call now. It was a lullaby, soothing and final, drawing her closer to the dark heart of the house. The shadows seemed to dance to the music, their forms circling her like predators, their eyes glowing with the same hollow hunger that had consumed the others. The souls, once trapped, now alive in the shadows, watched her with vacant gazes, their forms flickering in and out of existence, slipping between the veil of the living and the dead. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she turned toward the cracks in the floor, a sense of hopelessness seeping into her bones. The door had vanished. There was no escape. The walls were closing in, the shadows were reaching, and the violin was playing its final, inevitable tune. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to steady her racing heart, but it was no use. The music had taken hold of her completely. Her hands trembled as she reached out toward the pedestal in the center of the room, the violin still resting on it, its strings vibrating with an otherworldly energy. Without thinking, her fingers brushed the cold wood of the violin. The moment her skin made contact, the music stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence. But Claire didn't feel the relief she had expected. Instead, the silence felt heavier, more suffocating than the music ever had. It pressed in on her chest, and for the first time since entering Blackthorn Manor, she felt the full weight of the house upon her, its dark, ancient power. The oppressive force of the place filled the air, like a fog that smothered her every breath. And then, in that suffocating silence, she heard it, a voice, soft, almost tender. yet unmistakably real. It whispered in her ear, its words sending a chill down her spine. Welcome home. The words hung in the air, a final, cruel confirmation of her fate. The voice wasn't just the house, it was Blackthorn Hollow itself, its very soul calling to her, pulling her deeper into its depths. The realization hit Claire with the force of a tidal wave. The house had never been haunted. It wasn't just a prison, it was a sanctuary. A dark, twisted sanctuary for lost souls. A place where the dead could come to rest, to be bound forever to the house. She wasn't just trapped in Blackthorn Manor, she was a part of it now. Her soul, like the others before her, had been claimed by the house. It had welcomed her in, and now there would be no escape. As the shadows reached out for her once more, Claire felt the pull. It was undeniable. The violin's music, the whispers, the dark energy of the wooey house, it was all part of her now. There was no running, no fighting. She had come looking for answers, but the only truth Blackthorn Hollow had to offer was the one she had just discovered. This place didn't just hold the dead, it fed on the living. Her fingertips brushed the strings of the violin one last time, and as she did, the music swelled once more, louder and more insistent than before. The shadows engulfed her, pulling her into the very fabric of the house, her body growing cold, her vision blurring as she was swallowed by the darkness.